Good afternoon. Thank you for coming and welcome to the lecture and panel discussion entitled Tilting the Playing Field, Women in Sports Media, organized jointly by the International Communication Association and the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. I'm Francois Hendricks. I'm professor of media sociology at the Free University of Brussels, Belgium, and I'm the current president of ICA. Today's lecture is only the second of a new ICA lecture series. These events are organized to foster exchange between media and communication scholars and the various stakeholders whose interests touch upon the many topical research objects currently being investigated by our community of about 5,000 members worldwide. All too often, the academic community is blamed for confining itself in a bubble in the ivory tower. This, of course, is not groundless. We feel that as communication scholars, because we study everyday life objects that are socially, politically, and economically so important nowadays, we have a particular responsibility to reach out to the civil society, not so much to lecture anyone, to tell them how to do things, but to engage in a dialogue that should, and I'm sure will, be mutually beneficial. Today's theme resonates quite nicely with the overarching theme of our upcoming conference next May in Seattle, The Good Life, which will reflect on the rising importance of well-being as an expectation and even as a social value, and how communication and the systemic changes to the ways we communicate will affect these values. The practice of sports and the role models provided by elite sports and its representation in the media are very obviously related to the notion of good life. Our third lecture, the next lecture, will continue to carry our theme of the good life. On the 2nd of April, at the University of Illinois, Chicago, we'll be joining the Electronic Visualization Laboratory to present Human Augmentics, Cave 2, and the Future of Communication Technology, where we will explore the impact of communication technology, the impact communication technology is having in the medical field and our personal health. Before we pass it over to Mary Hardin, who will be leading the discussion tonight, I'd like to introduce Silvio Weisbord. Silvio is professor and director of the graduate studies in the School of Media and Public Affairs here at Georgetown University. He's the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics and the incoming editor of ICA's flagship journal, the Journal of Communication. Silvio.
Thank you, Francois, and all of you for coming here. Thank you, the International Communication Association, for hosting this event, for organizing this event. It's our pleasure to as a member of this school to co-organize and co-host this event with ICA, and I hope that is the first one of a long series of collaborations. After all, we are located in the same street in the same city, so I think probably there's something there for 21st Street becoming the next K Street, at least in the world of communication. I want to introduce Professor Mary Hardin, who will be the moderator of the panel. Professor Hardin is Professor of Journalism and the Associate Dean for Undergraduate and Graduate Education in the College of Communication at Penn State University. She's also the director of the Arthur W. Page Center for Integrity in Public Communication and Associate Director of the John Curley Center for Sports Journalism in the college. From 2004 to 2010, she also directed a Dow Jones News Fund training site for top editing students from across the U.S. Her research focuses on issues of gender, diversity, and professional norms and values in the mediated sports workplace, and has been published in multiple journals, including Sex Roles, Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, Mass Communication and Society, and the Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media. She serves on the editorial board for a number of journals and is associate editor of the journal Communication and Sport. Before completing her PhD, Professor Hardin worked as a newspaper reporter and editor. She also has worked as a freelance magazine writer, newsroom consultant, and contract public relations writer. Her PhD is from the University of Georgia, where she was named Distinguished Alumni Scholar in the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication in 2013. Professor Hardin.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and I want to welcome everyone to what I anticipate will be a very interesting and valuable conversation around women in sports media. And I want to set this up by telling you we're going to approach the topic in several different ways. We're going to talk about, for instance, the decision makers around issues of women's sports coverage. But we're also going to talk about the framing of critical issues around women's sports, particularly Title IX, and we can't overstate the importance of Title IX. And we're going to talk explicitly and specifically about the ways female athletes are covered. And we're going to integrate two critical points of view. First, that of scholars, researchers who take the theory and the data and observe the trends and share those results. But just as importantly, to really enrich the conversation, we're going to hear from our on-the-ground experts, people who make things happen in the real world. And joining us, and I'll talk more about these folks later, but journalist Christine Brennan and Title IX advocate at the national level, Neena Chaudhry, and I'll introduce them in more detail later. First, what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about the researchers who are here with us. The first one, and you'll hear her presentation first after mine, is Assistant Professor Erin Whiteside. She is Assistant Professor of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She focuses on the experiences of women in sports media professions and on media messages around Title IX. And she's published in leading journals. I also want to add that she's a former college athlete. She's a former writer-editor for Major League Baseball, and she's a former sports information director. Erin's going to be talking about media discourse around Title IX, and of course, again, we can't overstate the importance of that. After she speaks, we're going to hear from Andy Billings. He's the Ronald Reagan Chair of Broadcasting at the University of Alabama. He has 9 books, going on 10 soon, more than 90 journal articles, and they focus on mediated sports, identities, and fandom. And I would tell you, he is the go-to authority on trends in televised coverage of the Olympics and on fantasy sports, among other things. And Andy's going to be sharing his latest data from NBC coverage of Sochi Olympics, and he's going to be contrasting that with data on coverage of women's sports in general. Now, I'm going to get things started here, and by talking about research out of the John Curley Center about identities of media gatekeepers in sports and how that might impact coverage. So just thinking about what we might call the gatekeepers. And I'm going to get this started by talking about not the Olympics, which is, of course, is a mega event on a global scale, but instead a mega event in the U.S. that many of you probably, most of you probably watched at least a part of. And that, of course, is the Super Bowl. And in the run-up to the game, you probably were following some of the coverage, at least in the run-up to the game, as the storylines were developed. One of those storylines was this idea of ending the drought, right? It was Seattle against Denver, and one of the storylines was Seattle potentially ending the drought. So before the event, and even during the event, as it was aired on Fox, during the Super Bowls, it was aired on Fox, we saw this storyline, right? So Seattle's last title, and this is from Bleacher Report, which is a very popular, well-trafficked website. And here's the online site, Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Again, the same headline there, you can see it. The last time Seattle won a national championship. Now let's get a picture. Let's think about who are the journalists sort of forwarding this storyline. Who were creating this storyline. And so to give you a sense of who those folks were, I'm just going to put a picture up here. And this is from what I would say is not the non-newsworthy, but always very heavily covered media day before the Super Bowl. And you can see here, I like to call this sort of a where's Waldo, but instead this is a where is the woman in this picture. So we have lots and lots of journalists there, lots of folks with cameras, and I'm having a hard time finding a woman in this picture. Maybe you spot one. I think maybe, but I'm not sure. The bottom line is I'm not saying that there weren't women covering the Super Bowl. Certainly there were. But what I'm saying is that this picture sort of captures generally the picture in mediated sports, which is that it is dominated by men. Now, there was one news organization that did sort of correct the record, the factual error around this storyline, and that news organization was the Seattle Times, which pointed out that the Storm had actually won 2 national championships, one in 2004 and one in 2010 in the WNBA. Now, what's unusual about the Seattle Times? Well, I'll tell you from the perspective of the John Curley Center, and that is our research, our survey research in 2012 found that the Seattle Times had a higher percentage of women in their sports operation than most other sports operations in news organizations across the country. Could that perhaps be a reason that we see this kind of story, this kind of blog post in the Seattle Times, a higher percentage of women in that particular sports department? Now, generally speaking, I'm going to put one number up here. I could give you a lot of numbers, but if you're like me, you don't have a head for remembering a whole lot of numbers. I'm just going to give you one to remember. It does have an asterisk, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But generally speaking, this is the percentage of women across the country that research has shown over and over and over again, and we've been tracking this for more than a decade, and other organizations too. Richard Lapchick's Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport also tracks this. We use different methodologies, but we tend to arrive at generally the same number over and over and over again. It hovers around 10% of the overall number of overall pool of sports journalists across the country in hundreds of news organizations are women, and this also applies to sports information. I think sports information is very important when we think about the promotion of women's sports and the coverage of women's sports. And Acosta and Carpenter in 2012, their survey found, again, right at 10%. 10% of the sports information directors at all colleges and universities in the United States are women. When you talk about Division I, it's interesting, it drops precipitously. It's only about 3%. 3% of SIDs at Division I schools are women, so 3 of every 100. So again, there's a give and take in these numbers a little bit in terms of percentage point or two, but consistently over time, that's the number to remember. I want to sort of give you, just a perspective here in thinking about this. Generally speaking, it's a higher percentage of women in the U.S. Armed Forces than there are in a given sports department meeting in any newsroom across the country. The exception, and the one organization that tends to drive the numbers up, is ESPN. And we can talk about why that is. I'll just tell you that organizational sort of life cycle theory tells us that older, more established news organizations are going to pay more attention to diversity. And the reason they're going to do it is because, and this is what the research shows, they feel they can afford to pay attention to diversity. Okay? So an organization like ESPN alone can drive the numbers up and sort of skew the general picture across the U.S. I mean, the problem to me is that with the media landscape that we have right now, which is rapidly shifting, and we have a lot of new startups, relatively new startups like SB Nation, Bleacher Report, and others. I mean, they're popping up every day. When we look at organizational life cycle theory, what it tells us is that we shouldn't expect those organizations to put the priority that we would want them to put on hiring female staffers. So we've got some challenges in front of us. And according to our research, again, our latest survey, we found that a third of all sports departments in the U.S. had 0 women in their sports departments. So this doesn't mean that women in sports media haven't attained high visibility, because there are a handful who have. They're well respected and or well recognized in the field. And so what happens is we have profiles that have risen, and of course that is a good thing, but perceptions and images don't always align. And I'll use an example here to illustrate my point. Go to Google and type sports reporters into Google Images. And this is what you get. Now, you get a whole lot of pictures of women which doesn't match the demographics, and you get pictures of women that I'm sure you don't like as much as I don't like. Okay, so this isn't the reality, nor would we want it to be the reality. Okay, so again, images and perception and reality aren't quite the same. In fact, our research shows that the way that we've come to think about it is that it's a revolving door. What I mean by this is there are more young women going into sports journalism than ever. That's really exciting. But what's happening is we've got just as many after a few years who come right back out the door. So what you have is the group of women, that group that sort of stays and moves up, has remained stable over time. It has not expanded like we would wish that it would. Okay? And there are a lot of reasons for this, but a lot of it has to do with the challenges that women face when they move into sports departments and try to move up. Here's an example of perhaps a small challenge, trying to find a bathroom when you're trying to cover a story. So a challenge and a victory here in this tweet. Props to Honda Center for having a women's bathroom in the press room. But it does make me wonder, and those of us at the Curley Center, what if there are a lot more women trying to access the women's room in the press box? So again, if there were more women, would we see coverage change if women were the gatekeepers? Okay, if we could get that 10% up. And what I would tell you is this, just something to think about here, and that is that research in other fields tells us that women and men do speak and write differently. So we have to ask, in sports reporting, might we see some changes there if we had more women in gatekeeping roles? We think it might. We think it might, okay? And an example here would be, and I think this is a pretty timely example with March Madness coming up, that our study, we worked with some other researchers around the country, looked at March Madness coverage, and here's what we found, and that is that women covering female athletes tended to use more descriptors that showed their athleticism than men covering female athletes. So there were differences in the way they were covered. We've also found that when men and women talk about Title IX and write about Title IX, they use different descriptors and they use different types of sources. So we think there might be something to this. In other words, that content and the number of folks, a number of women in the field can make a difference here. Also, when we survey men and women who cover sports, what we find is that women are more concerned about overall levels of coverage. So again, there are some differences here. Okay, so this could make, again, a big difference in content, we think. We're not sure. There hasn't been enough research on this, but I want to put that idea out there. Now, it's not monolithic, and here's what I mean by that. In our interviews, in our focus groups, in our surveys of women, what we find is that not all women are willing or want to advocate for more coverage of women's sports. We certainly understand that it's a divisive issue. It can be a divisive issue among women going into the business. What I want to say here, though, is we think that maybe if women's sports had a higher value, had a higher profile, that might help close the revolving door. Let me show you what is generally the current beat structure in sports departments, right? I mean, this is sort of the beat hierarchy, regions and seasons aside, right? So this isn't completely monolithic here. I mean, most women, when they start out as sports journalism, they're pretty low on that beat hierarchy, and it takes them longer to move up than men, okay? So that revolving door. What we tend to argue is that if we changed the beat structure, in other words, if the profile and the respect and the coverage of women's sports moved up in the beat hierarchy, the lot of female journalists, we think, might improve. In other words, we might see more, there might be more incentive for women to enter the business and stay in the business, but that begs the chicken and egg question. Do we need more women covering sports to get better coverage of female athletes? Or will a higher profile and more respect for women's sports make more women want to get into journalism and move up? Either way, lots of questions here to think about and to explore, and I'll just put some key findings here. And we'll move on. Just want to, things to think about here as we move on to talking more now about specifics and content. So now I'm going to turn it over to Erin Whiteside, and she's going to talk about issues in Title IX coverage.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here today. I will be addressing some of the ways a key issue that's really important to women's sports is covered, and that is Title IX. I'm just curious, how many of you are aware of Title IX and know what it is? Okay, good. That's actually more than what we tend to see when we poll people. We're talking about a law that essentially states that at any federally funded institution, girls and women must have equitable opportunities and resources compared to what boys and men receive. So that's a very simplistic definition, and we have an expert on Title IX here today that I hope will elaborate on that. Goes beyond sports, but it's mostly well known in sports, and so I'll focus on how that law is particularly covered in media. Title IX actually celebrated its 40th anniversary in 2012, and Sports Illustrated gave it some nice visibility in a June issue of that month, and that was 2012. It celebrated its 40th anniversary. And this is pretty unusual because Sports Illustrated generally does not include women's sports content within its pages. So some nice visibility there. Support for Title IX is absolutely critical for the future of girls and women in sports. And so for that reason, as a women's sports advocate and scholar myself, I think it's very important that we continue to monitor how this law is covered at key events like anniversaries, lawsuits, public policy decisions, and so on. And when we do that, when we monitor and analyze the coverage, I think we can better understand how we, the audience, are invited to understand the law, its strengths and its weaknesses. But we can also get kind of some some insight into wider cultural assumptions about gender in sports that can be really useful into thinking about why support for Title IX might be building or eroding. One thing that women's sports advocates in general can be really happy about is the general support for the idea of the law among sports reporters. Title IX is grounded in fundamental American neoliberal values of fairness and justice. It is situated in the values that we as Americans hold near and dear to our hearts. And so for that reason, we generally don't see outright criticism of the idea behind the law. This excerpt is from a study Marie and I did looking at op-eds around the time of Title IX's 30th anniversary, so this is opinion articles. And the Tampa Tribune wrote, "Few would argue with Title IX's basic principle of fairness." And this is a fairly common sentiment, again, because we're talking about a law that's grounded in equity and justice. So ultimately, Title IX is good in theory. Where we start to see criticism of the law in media coverage is in its application. In other words, Title IX is good in theory, but it's problematic in practice. And this stems from common sense assumptions about gender in sports, the idea that men and boys are naturally athletic and thus better suited for sports compared to girls and women, and importantly, better worthy of the resources associated with sports, whether that be the best practice times, money for new uniforms, or more substantial financial outlays like scholarships or coaches' salaries that would allow a team at the collegiate level to continue. So when reporters, or any individual for that matter, subscribes to this ideology, it makes it really easy to say, well, hey, I like this idea in theory. It's great, fairness, equity. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in practice to take resources from a finite pool and give them to female athletes who don't really deserve those resources, are not worthy of receiving that kind of money in relation to sports in the first place. And so it's this line of logic that I think contributes to coverage of Title IX that depicts the law in really contentious terms. In other words, we tend to see this idea reflected in coverage. Title IX is a battle. It's a gender battle. We did a study that looked at coverage of, at the high school level, looking at coverage of two lawsuits, one that was filed against the Michigan High School Athletic Association, one against the Florida State High School Athletic Association. 20% of the articles included war metaphors. So this is language like fight, clash, battle, and so on. We did another study looking at coverage in early 2000s that Marie led, and the vast majority of the headlines emphasize conflict. And so this is really important because just rhetoric like this really invites us to understand this issue as a battle between men and women who are fighting each other. That, however, is not the only way to understand Title IX, and that brings me to my next point here, which I call misinformation and missing information. Again, this battle and war rhetoric implies a winner and a loser, battle of the sexes, and we know that over the past 40 years, opportunities for men and boys has continued to grow. Sporting opportunities have continued to grow. But the myth that Title IX hurts men in giving opportunities to women is taking away from men, that myth continues to endure. And that really stems from media coverage that positions any gains given to women as a simultaneous loss to men and boys. About half of all our stories looking at coverage from the early 2000s referenced losses to men and boys. So that idea is really present in media coverage. What we don't see, however, this is the missing information, is discussions about the distribution of resources within athletic departments. And this information is really critical to moving the debate away from a battle of the sexes, gender battle, and toward one where the focus is on social justice, where the focus is on how can we create opportunities for everyone, kind of across the board. And if you think about it, the emotion behind Title IX is a very contentious issue. In sports departments, in sports information offices, our research shows that it is considered a contentious issue. And the emotion is stemming from resources. Who gets these resources? But we know that athletic departments dedicate an overwhelming amount of resources to football, right? Very popular sport. Tremendous amount of resources dedicated to men's football. There are consequences to making those kinds of choices, and that may include an elimination of a men's team. And that's often the choice that athletic directors have made. It makes sense from this framework in terms of having discussions about the distribution of resources that coaches and athletes from what we call non-revenue producing teams, so maybe your men's gymnastics or your men's swimming, for instance, would actually align with supporters of Title IX to advocate for a more equitable distribution of resources that would benefit everyone, while also recognizing the might of football and the need for resources to go that way. I think it's also important, it's useful to think about how common journalistic norms and work routines shape how we understand Title IX. So in our study looking at high school coverage, we found that defendants, the high school athletic associations, representatives from those athletic associations, were quoted 60% of the time, plaintiffs 20% of the time. Why would such a disparity exist? And we think this may be a function of attribution norms related to journalism. So what you have is the filing of a lawsuit, someone asserting that their rights protected by Title IX are being violated. And so in the pursuit of balance, which we teach in our journalism schools, the reporter says, well, I need to get a comment from the defendant, from someone representing the high school athletic association. The problem is that that comment is coming in the form of a quote, right? And so when you are quoted, when you have a voice in the story, you have this really powerful, you're in this really powerful position to shape the narrative. And what we saw was that in 81% of all the stories that quoted a defendant, we saw those war metaphors that contribute to the notion of Title IX being this battle of the sexes. So we want to continue thinking about how journalistic norms and work routines regarding attribution and sources may actually undermine Title IX. I want to end here thinking about the 40th anniversary of Title IX, which happened in 2012. And this image is from the museum not far from here. There was a big event. Sports Illustrated, of course, put Title IX on its cover. So there's a lot of celebration at that point a couple years ago, really touting the gains girls and women have made over the course of the past 40 years. And there is a lot to be happy about, no question. A lot of the coverage narratives reflected this kind of positive approach to thinking about what girls and women have achieved over the past 40 years. Lots of lines like, oh, Title IX has opened the door for girls and women everywhere. The problem, however, is that not all girls and women have actually experienced a post-Title IX landscape in the same way. A study came out in 2012 that looked at participation rates from a variety of data sets and found that a smaller percentage of black girls participated in sports at the high school level in 2002, 27%, compared with 1972, where that number was at 35%. That same study showed that the participation gap between white and black women at the collegiate level has also widened. So I think this is where we have to focus moving forward. And the New York Times was one of the few outlets to pick up on this. And this was written by William Roden, where he says, race is by far the most debilitating limitation of Title IX, yet you barely hear discussion of it. This reflects an old way of thinking about inequality in which gender was the model, the only model. So again, when we use that rhetoric of opening doors, the pathway is clear for girls and women, we're really talking about white, middle, and upper class women. And that type of rhetoric fails to address the challenges that other groups of girls and women continue to experience. So what's next for media? I think a big part of it is exploring these nuances of Title IX with a special focus on some of the challenges that various racial and class groups are still experiencing. Secondly, focusing on the ideological terrain that guards against women's intrusion into sporting spaces. And what I mean by that is Title IX can legally create opportunities, but there's still a lot of cultural assumptions about how women should act or look, especially when it comes to sports. And those kinds of assumptions can almost function as invisible barriers. And finally, this is hard, but for any of us to kind of be reflexive about our own approach to work, but I do think we need to have a conversation about how to provide balanced coverage when we're talking about Title IX. This pursuit of balance right now is problematic, and choices about sources matter. So what is the best way going forward to cover this law that will continue to generate emotions on either side? I will end there. And I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Andy Billings, who will be discussing some coverage at the Olympics. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to be spending a little time on here today is just one way of measuring gender equity. And what I mean there is, we can talk about narratives, we can talk about salience, we can look at a lot of different issues on how women are covered in sports media. I'm looking at that foundational level because it's really where everything starts. You can't talk about how women are discussed in sports media until you establish that they are. And many times that's a hurdle that's been very difficult. So I'm going to be highlighting some research really from the past 20 years up to present that really gives you a sense of how the Olympics stands out, but also gives you a sense of where we currently stand here. Before I go on, I do want to establish, like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years, so there are a lot of co-authors that I have worked with that have helped along the way, and I do want to acknowledge those both past and present. We've been working really hard, especially in the last month, to try and get some of this data ready for media outlets and things like that. Let's start with a baseline understanding what we're talking about with women in sports media. So overall, Michael Messner at the University of Southern California has been working with Cheryl Cookie for a while, and now we have Cookie, Messner, and Hekstrom. For decades, they've been looking at this and have discovered that in 2010, we hit an all-time low in terms of the amount of coverage that women received, both in local news and in ESPN SportsCenter. So for instance, if you look at SportsCenter in 2010, 1.4% of all the coverage on SportsCenter was dedicated to women's sports. 2.7% of the ticker, the scrolling ticker on the bottom of the screen, was dedicated to women's sports. Almost all of it related to something with college and university where it's more building into that university affiliation. And a new all-time high for the big three sports, basketball, baseball, and especially football. at 71.7%. So what we basically have here is, Thomas Friedman is right. The world is flat, or at least flatter than it was. But it's also very hierarchical. And as we see more media platforms, both different types of channels and different types of internet outlets, we have greater excuses to shuffle everything that's not one of the big three sports onto those ancillary outlets. And that's not just women's sports, it's men's tennis, it's golf, it's NASCAR, it's a lot of different things there. But that gives you a sense. Now it's been that way for quite some time. Back in 2001, Susan Eastman and I did a study where we looked at SportsCenter in collaboration with CNN Sports Tonight, which was their nightly news program at the time. We actually found that coverage of the National Spelling Bee got more coverage than all women's sports collectively in the entire month of May. So Rebecca Silfon screaming about winning the spelling bee got more coverage than tennis, golf, basketball, anything that was happening during that time. So it really gives you a sense of how meager that coverage is. Now what's the outlier, of course? The Olympics, especially the Summer Olympics. So, like I said, since 1996, I've been looking at the Summer Olympics with various co-authors. And up until London 2012, we always found it came close to 50-50, but never quite there. NBC, especially in 1996 in Atlanta, dubbed that the Title IX Games because it was really the first generation of athletes that largely had grown up entirely in a post-Title IX era. That got really close, and actually their promotions, the majority of the promotions for upcoming events did go towards women athletes. But it's always come close and never quite gotten there until London. In London, as you can see, 54.8% of all the coverage in NBC's prime time, we're only talking about the evening telecast, in NBC's prime time was dedicated to women. Now, I do think that is, that gender becomes a secondary factor at the Olympics to the American flag. That's not just true in this country, it's any home nation's flag. So it certainly helped that women won the majority of the medals for the United States. More than anything, more than gender in the Olympics, you tune in, or a lot of people tune in, to see your home nation do well. And so as a result, we started to look at the summer games and said, okay, is London an anomaly or is it a trend? Are we starting to see that here? So you look at the winter games since 1998, much wider gap. So where we had a 2% gap for the Summer Olympics, we're now at 24% in the winter. I've actually even talked to people at NBC trying to figure out what's happening there. We aren't sure if it's the number of participants, the fewer number of sports that leaves less on the cutting room floor. We aren't sure what's going on there. But overall, the gap is much more substantial consistently. And even in 1998, that was CBS doing the coverage. So that gives you a sense there that it's not just one network going on there. So you see this zigzag pattern that happens a lot there, where the summer's always close, the winter's always further away, but then you actually see it cross in 2012, and that makes you wonder what's going to happen with Sochi, because we get this huge gap, 2% versus 24% between the summer and the winter. So we can start to, test drive this notion that London really hit some level of equality, or some people would say even potentially over equality. The Sochi composite that we looked at was 18 nights of primetime, because we had an additional night before the opening ceremonies for NBC. Got 100% of that, a little bit less than 40 hours of total clock time at the event or covering the event on NBC. What we found was a 4% gap, far smaller than we've ever had before for Winter Games. Still not the Summer Games. One great thing for a social science researcher is when you can eliminate a variable, and we got to do that this time with the medal count. So the United States won 28 medals, 13 men, 13 women, and 2 mixed or mixed teams. That allows us to say, okay, we can take that variable out of the equation here, and we can really start looking at what's going on here. And what we found is pairs was slightly up, probably the ice dancing. Women was definitely up in comparison to the previous 5. Men down as a result of those differences there. So if you add Sochi to the equation, you really start to see things narrowing with the Olympics. So that gives you a sense of if women are going to be shown, the Olympics is where you're going to see it. So now I want to go through the specific events real quickly. You'll find that more events had more coverage for men than women. 6 of those, you can see the difference there. You can look at ice hockey, for instance, and say, all right, that's interesting. Both of them got knocked out in the middle round by the same country, and yet one got a whole lot more primetime coverage than the other. You can also look here and say, all right, figure skating's really the main issue here, which might be the result of, even though women figure skaters did not medal, they were at least in contention and in the final rotation, whereas men largely took themselves out of the competition in the short program. Roughly equal with alpine skiing and snowboarding, you get a sense there. Now, I just want to take a few minutes here to talk you through some even more recent data to give you the opposite side of the coin. So in 2013 and 14, we worked on a project where once again we looked at SportsCenter, but we added Fox Sports Live to the equation. And part of that was because we wanted to see, is this an ESPN issue with that 1.4%? Or is it something that we'd find consistently in another comparable program? And for those of you who aren't familiar, Fox Sports Live is part of the new Fox Sports 1 initiative. It is their flagship nightly telecast that gets repeated over and over. So here we had 112 hours, and what we did was we took 2 different composites. One that was late October, early November, which we thought was peak male time. It's overlapping NFL, NBA, and college football. So that's going to really escalate there. And we took February, we said, hey, this is Olympic month. If the women are ever going to get some coverage, February is going to be that month for us here. To see, okay, how much does it change over time? Well, how much did it change? Here we have October, here we have October and November, here we have February. It changed, but very, very little. It's very hard to look at that and say, wow, it really escalated in February. In a way, it did. You start looking at the numbers and you can say, we had 7.5 times more coverage of women in February than October, November in that composite. Still, you can get a sense for overall, we're talking about 0.8% of overall coverage was dedicated to women's sports. That's SportsCenter and Fox Sports Live combined. Now, let's break it down. Is it a SportsCenter issue? Is it a Fox Sports Live issue? Well, overall, you can see both of them were very, very heavily favoring men's athletics. We actually looked at what were the most covered sports, and not only were they the same top 5 sports, all men's, they were in the same order and all within 2 percentage points of proportionality. So as much as we say, here's a new entrant into the equation, what we're largely getting is a mirror of, maybe the style's different, maybe the jokes to commentary ratio is different, but overall, the same sports in the same way. So you can get a sense there. Now you can say, okay, ESPN almost doubled Fox Sports 1. But at the same time, it's hard to look at 1.0% and really say that that's a great level of progress. So overall, I understand this is just one layer of the equation. Clock time, certainly matters, but so does salience, and certainly so does depiction. If we look at a Michaela Schifrin, or if we look at Lindsey Vonn, for instance here. Yes, she got the cover of Sports Illustrated, and a lot of our content analytic work starts to look at, all right, it's a more positive portrayal of a female if she's in athletic apparel and if she is performing her sport. We have less of those pictures than we do for men. Well, here we have, she's in athletic apparel, she's performing her sport. I don't know that when she actually performs, she turns for the camera that way. But overall, this is still a very sexualized picture. It's a very stylized picture. It's definitely trying to do something that we don't normally get on a Sports Illustrated cover. So those are the kinds of issues that we go through. I think clock time's important as a foundational issue, and certainly we can tease out a lot more of these issues that come from that, but that at least gives you a baseline of the Olympics versus the rest of the time. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Marie, who will then moderate our discussion.
All right. Well, thank you to Andy and to Erin. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about women covering sports. We've talked about Title IX. We've talked about content in terms of the Olympics and sort of everyday coverage. So now we want to move forward from here. I told you we were going to look at all these issues from some different angles. So now I want to introduce two women who I admire tremendously for the work that they have done in sports journalism and for women's sports. And the first person that I'm going to introduce, and I'm going to talk about both of these folks and then ask them to come up here and join us, is Christine Brennan. And I know that you all know who she is, right? You've seen her on television, right? With ABC News and other outlets. You've also heard her on NPR many times, give her commentary around sports. And you've also seen her column in USA Today, a very influential column, most read newspaper column written by a woman in the United States, oftentimes about issues in women's sports. But I want to tell you a few things that you may not know about her that I think are really germane to our discussion today. She was, for instance, the first woman to cover the NFL team here in Washington as a staff writer for the Washington Post in the mid-1980s. And before that, she was the first full-time female staff writer at the Miami Herald. I want to mention something else about her that I think is very, very important in light of our discussion. She was the first elected president of the Association for Women in Sports Media, a really important organization in terms of helping and encouraging women move into careers in sports journalism. And she started a scholarship and internship program to help and encourage young women move into these careers. So, Christine Brennan. And the next person I want to introduce is Neena Chaudhry, Senior Counsel and Director of Equal Opportunities in Athletics for the National Women's Law Center here in Washington. Now, she began at the center, and I became familiar with her because I saw her name a lot. We were doing a content analysis around Title IX, and I saw your name a lot in coverage. And she began at the center in a fellowship that eventually turned into a permanent appointment. She began in 1997. To me, the critical thing about that date and how long she's been involved with Title IX is she's been involved with some really critical junctures in the life of Title IX. So Erin talked about the lawsuit involving Michigan. You were involved with that. Also with legal issues at the national level, the Bush Commission in 2003 and 2004 around Title IX. So she's been around to see all of that. She's involved in litigation, lobbying, administrative advocacy, and public education. And she's the go-to source for reporters on issues related to Title IX and women's rights to sporting activities. So thank you for joining us, Neena. All right, and now I'm going to ask Erin and Andy to join me up here, and we're going to have a conversation.
It's right up here. Lights are...
All right, so we did cover a lot of ground, but we're going to keep going with the number of topics. And I want to start with Title IX because it's so critical, right, when we think about women's sports and where women's sports have come. So my question, and I'm going to throw this at Neena and Christine both, is Title IX still under threat, or is the time for vigilance behind us?
Well, I will say that it is definitely still under threat. I think we've certainly made a lot of progress in the now 42 years since the law was passed, but we at the Center have been involved in a number of lawsuits pretty recently where there are folks who are still arguing some of these same arguments that we heard in some of the research that was presented, namely that women are not as interested in playing sports as men and boys are, and that they therefore don't deserve the majority or their equal share of participation opportunities or resources. There were direct lawsuits that we were involved in against the Department of Education trying to basically roll back Title IX, and there was the Bush Commission, which ultimately did lead to some changes that then were overturned when the Obama administration came to Washington, but you know, we see these kinds of arguments even in cases that aren't directly challenging the law. So when we're involved in cases, it's often because women and girls are still not getting enough opportunities to play or equal resources, and we also hear from parents and students quite regularly and advocate on their behalf.
I just want to interrupt. Does a lot of this happen at the local level? A lot of is it at the high school level, the college level, where you're seeing the resistance?
All the way up, but yeah, we're working a lot right now in local, here in DC, for instance, and at the high school level, where we're still seeing big disparities, and particularly by race and gender. So for girls of color in particular, we're still seeing far fewer opportunities that their schools are offering them. So here in DC, for instance, there are many schools that don't have soccer teams, a few that don't have basketball teams. There are over 700 opportunities, more opportunities given to boys in the DC public schools than to girls. So we have a complaint right now that is pending.
And that's getting a fair amount of attention.
It is.
Which is good, of course, and that's, I guess, where we come in the media. My own high school in the suburbs of Toledo, Ohio, turns out about a year and a half ago, I received a phone call from the Toledo Blade, the newspaper that I interned at when I was starting my career, when I was still at Northwestern, a couple summer internships there. Get this phone call about my high school. And basically that it's not in compliance with Title IX. Well, anyone who knows me knows that you know, I was ready to go on that one. And it was shocking to me because, of course, I played 6 sports in high school back before people really cared about Title IX. It started, and you didn't have to focus. No one cared enough about girls' sports, so no one was focusing on girls' sports. Hence, you could play all of them. So it wasn't that I was such a great athlete. It was just that there was no sense of focusing on 1 or 2 sports, as we see with girls and boys now. So anyway, but the good news is, very quickly, this high school, and this would be, you know, it's suburban, so we're talking again about the group that has been well served by Title IX. But soccer and lacrosse was added to make sure the school was in compliance. But my quote that was on the front page of the Toledo Blade was that Title IX didn't show up 40 minutes ago, or 40 days ago, or 40 weeks ago, or 40 months ago. It's 40 years ago. And for any school, including my own beloved alma mater, it is just an embarrassment. So the bottom line is, to your point, it can be a very local story. From the national perspective, just real quick, as a journalist who has covered this issue a lot and continues to write about it, and always will, as much as I can, just a few kind of random thoughts. I think Title IX is the most important law in our country over the last 42 years. We can, I know, have some conversation about other laws that are hugely important. I think it will really start to show its benefits as women, maybe in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, as women run for president on both tickets, all tickets, whatever we have in our country politically, picking women for vice president. We are not that far away from those days. And the common denominator in my mind for all of those women leaders, whether it's politics, education, business, will be that they played sports because of Title IX. I think it's that big of a deal. And I kind of joke in speeches, Marie, that there must be like 3 guys in Montana hiding under a desk that still don't like Title IX. and you say to groups, especially I do a fair amount of speaking, groups that you expect you might be reluctant, you know, there might be those old guys that just, I'm not so sure I'm in love with this law. Well, did you love the London Olympics? Andy, to your wonderful research. Did you cheer for the United States? Well, then you know what? You love Title IX. Because were it not for Title IX, the United States would have been 3rd or 4th in the medal count. And U.S. women, of course, dominating. And really, it started out that way in Sochi. I was in Sochi. It started out that way at Sochi as well. The men caught up a little bit different dynamics, as you pointed out as well, Andy. But the Olympics is really the shining example. It is the Super Bowl for women athletes, and it is the wonderful result of Title IX, to the point where David Cameron, of course, the Prime Minister in England, talked about how England needs to find its own Title IX after David Cameron saw what was going on with the U.S. team in London. So I think we should be very proud of the successes, and we need to be vigilant. We, as journalists, all of us who care about this law, but I do think it has made amazing strides, and it's here to stay. There is no doubt about that.
Erin, you talked a little bit about war metaphors in coverage and sometimes the imbalance in the use of sources in these stories. Neena and Christine, can you talk a little bit about what you see as the media's role in making sure that people understand Title IX?
Well, I will say that over the years that I've been working on it, the media has been terrific on many fronts in terms of, making people aware of it. So I remember in 1999, as an example, the Atlanta Journal and Constitution did a series called The Gender Gap. It was an 8-day series, and they went out and they actually got data from local schools and showed just how many more opportunities boys were getting than girls, how all the money was going to football. And that story, which I know we talked to reporters for, led to a state law called the Georgia Sports Equity Act, which I think a lot of advocates seized on the information and were able to pass this law that requires some data to be collected and made public, and I think has helped, hopefully, to advance the cause of Title IX. So I definitely think the media can be a fabulous ally. I think it's also important just to note that Title IX, when you're talking about schools, where it's most applicable, does govern publicity, and I think a lot of people don't realize this. So, I'm, as a fan, not as a lawyer here, just constantly frustrated, right? So right now, I'm a huge basketball fan. I'm a Maryland alum, and I can't find the Maryland women. Now they're playing the ACC tournament tonight, but I can't find them on TV anywhere. I have to pay to watch them on the computer. Meanwhile, they're ranked higher than the men, who are also great, and they're all over the place. So from the very beginning, it starts with schools making sure that they're publicizing their girls and boys teams equally. It might be as simple as displaying trophies for your girls in the same way that you're displaying trophies for your boys. I've had a case locally where we had to make a school make that change. It was very simple, but they weren't doing it. And it was making the girls feel less than. And then it goes to publicizing your girls, having sports information personnel, glossy media guides, the same kinds of things that you're doing to promote your boys' teams, scheduling girls in prime time equally so that people can come watch them, their fans, their friends, their parents, and then promoting them, I think, trying to make sure they're part of the TV contracts too. And so, I always hear from people, well, you can't govern the media and they're going to do what they want and nobody's really interested, but I really think that if we enforce Title IX from the ground up, from the very beginning, and you build that fan base and you promote your women's teams equally, that the public will want more of it because they'll see more of it. I mean, people don't even know when the women are playing half the time. So I think that it's important to realize that the law has a role there too.
Well, and going back to March Madness, and you hear brackets, my bracket, no, there would be,
right.
It is plural, there are two. This is probably the worst month for women's sports because women's basketball is so good. Mm-hmm. It is better today than it was yesterday, and it'll be better tomorrow than it was today. The game is so different and so advanced and wonderful, and leading, of course, to the U.S. Women's Olympic team that is clearly the best the best team, the most dominant team in the world, any sport. The U.S. Women's Olympic team in basketball is just, and that's one of the reasons you don't hear as much about it, because they win so much that it's not covered. London Olympics, there were very few of us there covering that gold medal game because, okay, that's, check that one off. There's so many other sports you can cover at any Olympic Games. And so it just doesn't draw the attention because it's a foregone conclusion they're going to win the gold medal. So women's basketball is at its best. In this country, it's at the top of its game. And each year it gets worse and worse. This bracketology, March Madness has reached such a level in our culture. It's up there near the Super Bowl in terms of conversation at the water cooler. This is totally to the detriment of women. And I blame our media. How many times, hopefully you'll see USA Today use men's tournament and women's tournament. That pesky little adjective, men's, it is just, it's almost unused. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a column after President Obama did his bracket. I think it was the first year he was president, whenever it was, when he did it. And ESPN, they showed up and he did his bracket. And I just immediately wrote this scathing column in USA Today that I do know the White House read, saying, with two daughters, how dare you? There's bigger issues in the world than someone's bracket, but in this little snapshot. And sure enough, the White House immediately they came back and they did a women's bracket as well. And then the next year, they did ESPN, both having the men's and the women's on TV, and I know he will continue to do that. But little things like that just mean a lot. So I think there's that, and then another quick thought. In this conversation about paying athletes, and Erin, you know this as well as anyone, this conversation about paying athletes, it is absolutely imperative that we remember Title IX. And I'm out there screaming into the wilderness, and I will continue to do so, and others as well. I'm not alone, but there's very few of us that seem to, pay any attention to this. This notion of paying football, if we pay football players, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to pay the field hockey players. Otherwise, there will be 50 lawsuits on the first day they pay the football players, and 50 the next day, and 50 more the next, and on it will go. Title IX related, of course. This is a ridiculous concept that you can pay football and men's basketball and not pay your female athletes. Therefore, you're not going to be paying athletes for a long time because we will bankrupt every university, because in these economic times you cannot pay every athlete. So keep that in mind as we start to talk about that, because that is something, Erin, I'm sure you agree, Neena, that it is just ignored as male-dominated sports media continues to talk about an issue that is going to be illegal the moment it happens. Anyway.
I have had some reporters ask us that.
Yes.
Yeah, and we've said the same thing.
Good. Oh,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So there at least are a couple
Oh,
people
yeah.
paying attention. But isn't it? Have any of you heard of this? I mean, isn't it like paid football players pay
Right,
men's
they
basketball
right.
players?
And
Hello, there's this little law out there, Title IX. Anyway, okay, I'm done.
well, that's usually what is meant, right? When we talk about paying college athletes, we're talking about two groups of athletes generally.
Right, but it's against the law the moment
Exactly,
the
yes.
sentence is uttered out of your mouth.
Well, and even more than that, I mean, when we start using the words revenue generating, well, it depends on what university you're at. At the University of Tennessee, the women's basketball team turns a profit. At many other places, you know, the football team doesn't turn a profit or whatever it is. So what do we mean when we say revenue generating? And I don't know how you find your way out of that path.
Or you take it out of the academic model. My alma mater, Northwestern, is at the forefront of this, and I'm not going to get into that whole issue, but take it out of the academic model and then turn it into the workplace model. But then you're dealing with workers' comp, obviously union dues. Oh my goodness! And you would, every school would be D3 the next day because they couldn't begin to pay those salaries. So it sounds great, pay athletes. It is. But let's not forget Title IX in the midst of that conversation. And it seems like everybody is forgetting Title IX in the midst of that conversation.
I have another question I just want to throw out, and it's a pretty broad question, and it's the issue that we're all addressing in one way or another when we think about women's sports and media coverage, and that is, how do we move the needle? How do we get more coverage of women's sports? What do we need to be doing?
Well, certainly if you are angry about the lack of coverage, picking up the phone and emailing, letting your voice be heard that you are out there and you're angry and not happy with it. I've said this to groups around the country I've spoken with. And, you know, if you're watching the local news and not so, I mean, here in D.C. or wherever, you know, and you see let's say it's, again, this time of year, you see the boys' coverage, the boys' basketball team, the state championship being covered and the girls not. Unless you let people know that that is unacceptable, they're probably going to continue to do that. Now, you would say, and correctly so, well, they should know better. And I think more and more are doing a better job all the time. I mean, I think most newspapers really have, and Andy, I'd be interested in, or Erin, you guys, Maria, all of you, how the coverage of high school sports is locally. I think it's better, it's way better than college or anything else. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I just did some research looking at coverage of high school basketball. The girls get about 40%, boys about 60%, so it's about as close to even as you're going to find. But one thing that I think that was interesting that came out of the study is we coded for athletic descriptors. And at the high school level, there were no difference between athletic descriptors applied to boys and girls. And Andy showed the picture of Lindsey Vonn, and it doesn't make sense to put a model in the athletic or in the sports page. It makes sense to put athletes in the sports page. And so we've got to be understanding culturally women as athletes. And so at the high school level, I was really encouraged to see some equity in that regard. Now, there were some other problems. One interesting finding we found is that boys were more often described as powerful, big, phrases like, the imposing 6'8" center. We didn't see a lot of height, literally the descriptions of height of the girls, where you're invited to imagine this body as athletic. So there were still some discrepancies there, but I would say at the high school coverage we did, I saw more instances of describing these female high school athletes as athletic, as physical, and when you read that, you're thinking this is an athlete. You're not thinking this is a model. So it is a hard question to answer, but I think a big part of it is shifting cultural attitudes about what counts as an athlete? When I say the word athlete, what comes to mind in getting at that?
I wonder if culturally we draw a line at high school.
Well, I think partly it's
girls.
affiliations, right? You know, you feel a kinship to your hometown or whatever it is, so I want to see how my hometown's doing. And the same thing when we say, if you wrap it in the American flag, people are more likely to tune in.
Absolutely.
And part of it is, I think, you know, we're longing, in a society of niches, we're longing for those conversations that you know you can have at the dinner table or wherever you are that everyone can chime in with. And lots of times, we don't have those unless it's the Olympics or something big like that. So, you know, getting people in Tuscaloosa, Alabama to watch two West Coast teams to watch the WNBA is a lot harder than watching, you know, the U.S. women's basketball team.
But they're more likely to watch two men's West Coast teams.
Right. But that, I think, you know, we'll see what people think here. So much of it is, you know, I mean, whatever music you listen to growing up is the type of music you're going to listen to later on. And, you know, for me, for instance, you know, I don't follow the WNBA as much as women's professional tennis. Why? Well, I grew up waking up on Saturday mornings and watching Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert, you know, battling in Grand Slams. And that led me to Steffi Graf and Monica Seles and Martina Hingis and the Williams sisters. And so I'm not saying it needs to take that long, but at the same time, if you get that youth demographic, I do think they start to care. But we're missing that component somehow.
I will also say, as another, kind of going back to your question and saying that you should call in and let people know that you're not happy with it, the other thing that exists now that didn't exist, of course, 15, 20 years ago, is the internet. And so if you picked up your Washington Post or your Toledo Blade or your Tuscaloosa whatever, and you were angry you didn't see it, right? You care very much about the Wimbledon final with the Williams sisters or whatever it is, and you don't like the coverage that you're getting. Now you have a choice. You can leave the mainstream media behind. We've done such a horrible job of covering women's sports, my profession, horrible job. We have basically pushed generations of future consumers who will buy the products that the advertisers are going to be advertising for in the newspaper. We've pushed generations of girls and women away because they're not going to find their sports in that newspaper. Brilliant, huh? We pushed them away, and they're going right to the websites. So you care very much. Again, let's say you want to know what the U.S. women's national soccer team is doing. The odds are any newspaper in the country is not going to cover it. USA Today, and I think we do a very good job with women's sports by and large compared to others. I'm not so sure that that's a great compliment, but we do the best we can. But you'll see a paragraph or two. Maybe we even have a story. U.S. lost to Sweden today, actually, in the Algarve Cup. U.S. women's soccer, great winning streak now over, so that's just a big story. We might have something, I don't know, online right now. I'm guessing we probably do. But in general, most newspapers would not be covering that. So you've got a 10-year-old soccer player at your house, and you want to find out everything you can? Well, you can now, right? You go to U.S. Soccer's site, you probably go to Abby Wambach's site, you go to any number of bloggers. So the bad job we have done, and also then forcing ourselves to not have the product and the business of 51% of our population when they grow older, brilliant on our part. The bad job we have done, now there's an answer, and I think at least that's a positive. I'm not saying that replaces being in a huge newspaper like USA Today, New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, what have you, Washington Post, but at least the information is now available. It never was before.
I want to invite anyone during this last portion to, if you have a question for the panelists, please feel free to approach the mic and we'll make sure and get your question asked. But I want to throw this question out. How do we encourage women to seek careers in sports journalism more? And how do we encourage women to develop as fans? We have this really high participation rate in sports that continues to grow, yet it doesn't seem to translate into fandom. So either one of those questions. That was a double-barreled question there, I know. But sports journalism, sports fandom, how do we?
Well, we do have a lot of women getting into sports journalism, as you know, and the Association for Women in Sports Media, we've given out now, you mentioned the scholarship internship program that we got going back 22 years ago. Over 130 women have received scholarships and internships, and 6, 7, 8 more this year, and on we go. So I run into women all the time who want to do this. the number, the 10% that you saw, of course, is disheartening to me. I mean, I've spent my 30 years, 32 years of my life pushing for this, and we're not there. But we're doing okay. 10% is horrible. But Sports Editor of USA Today, the biggest newspaper in the country, is a woman, Mary Byrne. The national columnist for USA Today is a woman. You're looking at her. There are some real positive things out there. I'm just in Sochi, and I would say that a good half of the press corps was female. There are a lot of us. Kelly Whiteside from our newspaper. We had 4, 5, 6 women covering different events. I don't even think of it that way, but as I now thinking about it, speaking with you. So there are some real gains and some real positives, and I have to believe that as Title IX has just, again, swept up the nation, thanks, and the great work that you guys do to keep everyone on the straight and narrow, and to fight these battles that we cannot believe you still have to fight. But we are pumping out millions of girls and women in this country playing sports. They're going somewhere. They're going to politics. They're going to be, great moms and great coaches and great leaders and great educators, and whatever they're going to choose to do, they're better at it because they played sports. Well, some of them are going to get into sports media. And there's going to be more. They have to. And what will it look like 50 years from now? So I'm the eternal optimist. But I do think that things are going in the right direction, even though it's slow going.
What can we do to encourage them to stay? A lot of young women go into it, and they don't stay beyond 5, 6, 7 years.
Well, I think more are now. I mean, certainly there are a lot of us who are in our 40s and 50s doing this. It might just have to be, again, the workplace, men, the husbands and the boyfriends understanding that this is the career. I just think it's all, and I'll be quiet because I'm talking too much, but I think it's just a cultural change, and I think it's just things take time. Title IX is really new. I mean, it's 42 years old, but really the first 15 years were completely ignored. So this is an incredibly new law that we have fallen in love with as a nation. I just think everything's just going to take more time.
Well, and I'm just going to jump in, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think where there are fewer women in employment fields, we see this in lots of fields, not just sports journalism, but, that slide about not having a bathroom. I mean, I'm doing work on women in construction, too, as part of my job, and we have like 2.6% of women all the people in construction are women. And that number has not changed in 30 years, and what we hear is, the workplace issues that they face, whether it's harassment, outright discrimination, just sort of an unwelcomeness in many ways. And I don't know if that's the case per se, but it does seem like whenever you have fewer women in a field, if it's a non-traditional field for women, making sure that you're, enforcing their other laws that apply to the workplace too, and just sort of paying attention to those kinds of things certainly would help, I think, in terms of retention of women in those fields.
Mm-hmm. And getting at the second part of your question, where you said, how do you get them to watch?
Yeah.
Because that's something else about the Olympics that a lot of people don't.
Give them something to watch too. And I'm sorry, I'm a huge fan. I can't find certain things that I want to watch. So how do I get to the TV networks? That's what I want to know. I need to obviously complain a lot more.
but there's
you're doing your job. You're doing your job.
Yeah. There's also something to be said for. I mean, there are only 2 major sporting events that draw more women viewers than men. Mm-hmm. And they're the Olympics. I guess you could say 3 if you say winter and summer, which are about 58 or 59% women. And then very slightly, last I saw, the Kentucky Derby at like 50.4%.
Really?
That's funny.
That's it. That means the majority of people watching the WNBA are men. And I think that taps into something where you say we need to find out what we can do to get more women viewers, not just more women's sports content. And part of that can be teased out in the data. If you look at ESPN Integrated Media Research, they'll say, okay, it's men are more comfortable watching sports alone, women much more in groups. Well, is there something that you can tease out there as far as making some of this more social, whether it's fantasy games or whatever it is, that appeals somehow in a different way where you can reach out to those people? Because there's the content and then there's the viewership at home, and both of those issues need to be addressed.
I think part of this puzzle, even this is a sports panel, but part of the puzzle, it has nothing to do with sports and everything to do with gender roles in the home.
Yep.
So Marie and I did some research where we talked, we had some group conversations with married heterosexual women, and one of the biggest things to come out of this is, I'd love to watch sports, but I've got laundry. I have to make
Who's gonna watch
dinner,
the kids?
And we know, the sociologists doing work on gender and labor, we know that even heterosexual couples that enter into a marriage committed to an egalitarian distribution of labor, inevitably, women start taking on more and more of that. An important part of that is women in the home, when there's a family, are often responsible for the happiness of everyone during leisure time, and watching sports is leisure time. So it becomes taking a backseat role and letting the husband or the kids choose what they want to watch. They have more access and connection to men's sports, and that in many ways kind of reproduces itself in terms of choices of what they're going to watch in the home. So another part of our research that came out from those conversations is women really like the Olympics. Well, I know in my home we have kind of an ongoing joke. My mother, when we're watching a basketball game or something, she's up, she's down, she's up, and inevitably she comes and sits down and the commercial starts. And we just always laugh about that. But the Olympics, it's really nice, right? You can watch a 15-minute, the way it's packaged is 15 minutes. You get a little human interest story. You identify with the athlete that you've never heard of. You watch like the top 3 downhill skiers. You root for the American, and you can go back to, in the kitchen to finish cooking that dinner. So I think it is, when we're talking about why women don't watch sports, I think gender roles in the home have got to be a part of that conversation.
And again, I would just say, the 10-year-old girl today, what is that household going to look like when she's 40? And I'm not disagreeing. You've nailed it, totally nailed it. And mom's driving the minivan, and the minivan revolution was the '99 Women's World Cup, anyway. But the 10-year-old girl today, that's going to be a different household when she's 40 than what just has to be. I mean, already the numbers, right, of the women as the wage earners and the breadwinners. I mean, these numbers are changing every year, and it's as if our political parties don't even notice it, right? So much this is happening, and we're kind of like it's bubbling to the surface. So in many ways, it's cultural, I think, as much as sports, as you said. So it's kind of an interesting thought where we're headed, because that 10-year-old girl is getting a sports experience very different from the 10-year-old girl 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, because Title IX is so much more advanced, especially, I guess I'm speaking mostly of the suburban, girl as opposed to the inner city girl, which is a whole other issue.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm keeping my eye out. It's hard for me to see. If you
really
have a
hard.
question,
Right,
I see one in the back.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Leah Edwards. I'm a mass communication student at GW, and I'm also broadcast for WRGW Radio. So I call some of the women's basketball games. And I was curious, you talked a lot about TV and that kind of coverage, but how could radio play a part in more coverage of women in media? And also, what can I do as a student who's so passionate about this topic to spread it around?
Well, unfortunately, what radio often ends up being is the shock jock screamers. That's like the last, bastion for the, the Neanderthals. And I do a lot of those shows, and I tell you, it's great stuff. Love being on there, driving, get out inroads here and there. So really, and of course, a lot of what ESPN2 is playing to its base. Let's just face it. So in many ways, the numbers that we see with ESPN, as you guys have pointed out so well, and Andy, especially you, with your survey, it's, okay, we're going to double down on that, right? And it's the same with the political parties. You play to your base. Everything's the base. So I think, and even with ESPN's numbers during Sochi, I work for ABC News, and I was working with Julie Foudy and Bonnie Ford and whatever were together, because they're ESPN and ABC, we're all together. And ESPN would be doing maybe even less coverage of the Olympics, because the last thing they want to do is drive viewers to it. So that's one of the reasons you see the numbers being so bad. I think they'd do more if they felt like they could have a piece of the coverage in the evenings. But, I think your question is a great one. Leah, was that Leah? Yeah. And I just think that just keep plugging away. Diversity is important, and being in that conversation is everything. Billie Jean King says it better than anyone. We need women to be in charge of these companies. Obviously, in this case, you're talking about a university radio station. But, what someday women will be in charge. There will be a woman in charge of ESPN someday. I don't think I'll be breathing, but there will be. It's going to happen. If it's 100 years from now, if there's an ESPN, who knows? So to be in those conversations, to look the guys in the eye and say, hey, we got to cover this. And I'm going to do a show on this, and I want to make sure I bring the top player in to do the post game. You just have those conversations. All of us women who've done that, been in the room, and we just say you got to cover this stuff, and it's not easy, and I know it can be tough at times, but keep going.
Next question.
Always hated these things. My name's Steve. I am a news producer here in the city. Thank you very much for the forum, and it's always great to be in the company of the incomparable Christine Brennan. Could you take a survey of the data that was or isn't available from the Beijing Games, especially the coverage peaks or valleys of men's basketball and women, prominent women in sports? And also, Christine, to one of the points you mentioned earlier, could you look at the complexion of the newsrooms? When I started, first at a newspaper and then in television, we were using hairline tape and pica poles and laying out agate that way, and now it's completely different. So could you just sort of examine the great number of women that are in producing positions and maybe not management, but who are there, though the coverage doesn't reflect that? Thank you all.
Yeah, I can tell you we've looked at Beijing in a number of ways, but I know you specifically mentioned basketball, and that's another interesting case. So what I tend to look at are mega sporting events, things that people watch en masse. And so I focus on prime time. And as a result, there's no basketball in prime time. At this point, for instance, here's a factoid for you. 94% of all Summer Olympic prime time is just 5 sports: gymnastics, swimming, diving, track and field, beach volleyball. Now, the skeptic then says, okay, we get a whole lot of women, but we get a whole lot of women in swimsuits and leotards. But these are sports that the United States does well, and they're sports that can be divided into digestible segments for the viewing audience for NBC. And so, I don't really have anything specific for basketball, because even that gets shuffled aside, because showing a basketball game in 7-minute programming segments, doesn't tend to work very well.
Just thinking ahead too, not answering your question, Steve, but the thought of what you were saying, Andy, going into Rio now. Of course, Sochi's done. Now we head to Rio, and one woman for sure, maybe 2, will be the superstars. One of them's from right here. Missy Franklin, is going to be the bomb. You are going to see commercials galore. She is terrific. You guys remember her, of course, from London. She's just beginning. And it's great to think that after a couple of years with, times with Michael Phelps, who was deservedly so, got all the attention, it's going to be a woman. Guarantees. As sure as I'm sitting here, Missy Franklin is the star going in, unless it's Katie Ledecky, who, of course, is growing up and living right here a few miles away in Bethesda. And Katie actually had maybe a better year in swimming this past year than Missy. So you've got these 2 superstars. Another point, Sports Illustrated did, I think, Andy, is it right? 4 Erin, you might know, 4 covers going into Sochi. They did 4 different covers. Yes. Mm-hmm. 3 of the 4 were women. Yeah. Gracie Gold, was Schifrin going in. Who were the other 2? Anyway, but bottom line is 3 of the 4, they were all fully clothed. You'll be happy to know. And then coming out of the Olympics, of course, Schifrin on the cover of SI. And looking terrific, not at all like that Lindsey Vonn pose, but totally just a great picture. And Michaela Schifrin has already said she wants to go for 5 gold medals in Pyeongchang in 2018. So basically what we're saying is now we have guaranteed that Schifrin, assuming these athletes stay healthy and keep doing what they're doing, she will be the face of the games in 2018. There's a lot of positive there. You got those 2, women and superstars back to back heading into the next 2 Olympics, almost guaranteed. And as far as the question about women behind the scenes, absolutely. There are so many women editing. 10% isn't great. It should be 30% by now, and it should be 50% in another 30 or 40 years. It's not going to be, and Marie, your research has been fantastic on that, and you've led the way with awesome and getting that word out. But 10% is not insignificant. It might actually be 12%. But there are some key players, big-time players, so thank you for allowing us to say that.
We'll give up one last question right here.
Hi. I want to say thank you to the panelists. I happen to be in town today, and I really do consider this a star-studded lineup. I'm really excited I was able to come by. I have another question for Dr. Billings, sorry, because I know you just got one, but when you were talking about the role that nationalism plays in the coverage of athletes, it got me wondering if you ever looked at the Olympics and the gender distribution of international athletes, because I know that you found the coverage really skews towards American athletes, and that is partly why they show so many women, but when they're showing international athletes,
Right.
is it also similarly distributed?
Yeah, I do nationalized analyses as well. And for instance, I'll tell you in London, 55% of all the names mentioned were American athletes. That means more than all other nations combined. All right, that's interesting in and of itself, especially when consider often those international athletes are the antagonist to the American protagonist. Those athletes are also described in very different ways, and a lot of it I think is very attributable. So for instance, international athletes are very two-dimensional. They get more comments about their experience, their speed, things that you can look up. The American athletes, it's much more likely to be composure, courage, things that you can't immediately look up. Now, if you start to look at that, I mean, part of that's language barriers where you can't get the full story from a lot of people. A lot of it's not knowing context from different nations. And a lot of it also is, I mean, we have a lot of the same broadcasters covering the U.S. Olympic trials, so they know more of those backstories. They can talk about a person's courage because they have that there. But yeah, it's certainly a major part of this, and so that at least gives you some insight there.
Maybe, just to follow up, from the point of view of covering this, I never think, oh, I'm going to cover women's sports at the Olympics.
Right.
I know I picked the most the most macho guy covering the Olympics as a journalist. He doesn't think that, not the Olympics. You're going to cover Bonnie Blair, and she's about to win her 5th gold medal, and that's the story. It happens to be it's Bonnie Blair, but you're not even thinking gender. And I think that's maybe the model that would be great to get to someday for all sports coverage. And that's a long way away if it happens, but it is so fascinating. You're not thinking, I'm covering women, you're covering skating. I'm at figure skating, and oh, by the way, the women are the ones standing up, and the men a week earlier were all falling apart. But you're not even thinking, you don't even write that, because you're not even thinking gender. So I think it's a fascinating conversation to have, that the Olympics is so different from any other thing where anyone would say, oh, I'm going to go cover women's basketball. You would never say, I'm going to go cover women's whatever, because you're just covering the big event of the day, which more and more, especially from a U.S. point of view, happens to be the women's competition.
Yeah, you'll tune, real quickly, I know, but you'll tune in to say, hey, I'll see how the U.S. team's doing. I've never heard of anyone say, well, let's go see how the men are doing, with the Olympics. Let's tune in tonight and see how the women athletes are doing. I mean, instead, it's simply, it's the Olympics. It's much less of an issue.
Well, let's hope that our day-to-day coverage goes in that direction. So thank you so much to Neena, Christine, Erin, and Andy for a terrific discussion. And thank you all for coming.